In this video, we're going to get started working with TileMap. The first thing we need to do is create a grid that we're going to be able to paint in. So go to Create, 2D Object, select TileMap. This is going to create a grid object, and the grid is basically where we're going to be painting our environment. Within this grid, you'll see a TileMap child game object. A TileMap can be thought of as a layer. Within our environment, we're going to have several tile maps, each acting as their own layer. So we'll have foreground layers, we'll have background layers, midground layers. These are each going to be represented as their own tile map. So we're going to start off with our ground layer. So let's call this ground_tile map. Anything we paint is going to be on this ground tile map layer. You can see here that I've renamed that to ground tile map. And if we look in the tile palette, you can see here that the active tile map is ground tile map. So anything that we are painting is going to be assigned to this ground tile map layer. The next thing we want to do to get started is create a palette. A palette is going to host all of the sprites that we can then paint. So let's create a new palette. Let's call this ground items. Select create, and it's going to save this palette as an object. So we want to keep this very organized. So let's open up our sprites folder and let's create a new folder called TileMap. Open that up, and let's create another folder within this called palettes. Select that folder and save that out. From here, you'll see here in the sprites folder, if we go into TileMap palettes, we have our ground items palette. The next thing we want to do is we want to populate this palette with our ground item sprites. So if we open up our environment here and we go into our level folder, we have a ground sprite. We need to now take these individual tiles and place them in there. Before we can do that, we actually need to slice this image up so that we can turn this into multiple tiles that we can then select from and begin painting. To do that, we need to make this a multiple type sprite. So on sprite mode here, change it to multiple and select apply. This is going to allow us the ability to cut it up. From here, open up the sprite editor, and it's going to bring up this panel. From here, select slice, type, make sure it's on grid by cell size. The designer who created this informed me that we are to use a 128 by 128 pixel size. When you're ready, hit slice, and it's going to cut these individual tiles out. When we're ready, hit apply, and you'll see here that if we close this panel, hop back over to the sprite, it has now created individual tiles at a 128 by 128 ratio. Now that we have our ground tile selected, we want to change this pixels per unit. We want to make it the same as the individual tile. So our tiles are 128 by 128, so pixels per unit is going to be 128. Once you've done that, hit apply to save those changes. The next thing we need to do is we need to take this ground tile here and drag it to our tile palette. This is going to basically take all of those sprites, those 49 sprites, and convert them to individual tile assets. And it's going to save out those tile assets. So we're going to go into our sprites folder, drop into TileMap, and we're going to create a new folder called tiles. Within this folder, we're going to create another folder to keep it organized called ground. Select that folder, and it's going to create and generate all of the tile assets. The tile assets are what we're actually going to be painting. Let this finish. And you'll see here that inside our TileMap folder, we have our palette for ground items, and then we have our tiles. And inside our ground folder are all of the tiles that make up our ground. Also, you'll see here that in the tile palette, that now we have individual sprites that we can select using our paintbrush tool, and we can begin painting our level. In the next video, we're going to cover all of the functionality of painting using TileMap.